between what is considered event sourcing in the front end, such as using Redux, versus event sourcing in the back end, which is a completely different game. My name is Lucas Paganini, your host in the podcast. Joining me in today's episode are the also hosts Chris Fruen.
Hello, everybody.
Peter Osa.
Hi, everyone.
And our very special guest, which was also on our last episode of Adventures in Angular, another podcast also produced by Envoy and FrontendvsEvents, if you're interested in that, which is Luis Galeas, the CEO and founder of Envoy. Oh, sorry, dude. I think you got my company by mistake. So the CEO and founder of Ambar.
Yeah, we're not doing acquisitions at this time. Sorry. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Luis Galeas. I'm an engineer, even though I'm the CEO of the company. We help companies distribute data and do it in a way that's very easy, and it has great applications in event sourcing, which is our current market focus.
Awesome. Yes, Luis really is a mastermind behind event sourcing. He actually offers a free online course about event sourcing. So for those of you that are interested, you can go to ambar.cloud/ESC, which stands for Event Sourcing Course. And I met him because I did this course and I can vouch for it. It is really good. It is really well made. And I learned a ton from him. And I just thought, hey, dude, let's bring you to the podcast because I'm sure that this is going to be beneficial to a lot of developers. A lot of people don't have this context of how event sourcing is done. A lot of people don't even know what event sourcing is, like in fact, and applied to the backend. So I think this is going to be really relevant for those of you that want to know more about the backend side of things. So just an FYI, this podcast episode is not going to be a lot about React, but we're going to do a lot of comparisons between event sourcing and using Redux and other Flux patterns, which are very commonly used along with React. But you will see that it's pretty different when you're doing that in the backend. All right. So, Luis, let's start with some concepts. What do you think is relevant for us to define to the audience before we start talking about the rest of the subject?
So I think it's a good idea to start with events, right? And the inversion that we have in event sourcing, and similarly in Redux as well, when you're using this in the front end, right? So as opposed to having an application where you are tracking state and modifying state in place, what you're doing is you're recording events, right? So if somebody makes a click, then you react to that event by saying, I'm gonna modify my state in this way. So in this case, the state is really the the secondary part of your application, and your events are the primary part. And there are similarities in this regard, but there are definitely differences because in the front end, your application is very ephemeral, right? If you have a browser window open right now, you close it, great, that's it, right? Maybe you store some things in local storage, but beyond that, everything is stored in the server. When you're using this pattern in the server, it's much different because now you have to think about storing those events and being able to build your state and keep track of it. So again, the concepts to summarize what I've said, right, is that it's a similar inversion of the concepts where now instead of having state as your source of truth, your events are your source of truth and a state is a derivation. But despite those similarities, it's very different because you have to track your events in a permanent way as opposed to an ephemeral way where you can do it in the front end with a single server, single core, single thread of JavaScript running.
Perfect. Yeah. So there are like all the complexities that go along with dealing with those limitations, right? And okay, so Peter, Chris, do you guys think there's any fundamentals that we should cover before we get into event sourcing? By the way, do you two feel comfortable with event sourcing? Any particular basic questions about it? We can definitely tackle that now.
Okay, yeah, so for me, I think the idea, I think I'm just trying to create like a parallel, like try to compare and contrast here. So I think I may want to ask like a question. I think that's probably regarding like the principle behind event sourcing. Maybe just an overview kind of. Yeah, I get that. Yeah, it's actually maybe in a way that maybe like front end developers could relate to. Yeah, I know you gave one about Redux and all, but maybe something, I don't say it's close to low level, maybe code wise. Is it like an event boss or does it use event driven? Yeah, those kind of concepts. Yeah. So I don't know if that can be explained.
Yeah, so there are moving parts when you're doing this pattern in the back end, right? Because when you're doing everything in the front end, you can just do everything in memory, like I was saying. So when you think about how you're handling your events and how you're queuing them, when you are doing this in the front end, right, you just have an you know first in first out queue, and you handle messages like that, and then you apply them against your state, right? Okay, but how do you do that when you actually need infrastructure that does this? There are equivalent parts on the back end. So for example, on your queue of events that you have in the front end, you need a similar queue that is more permanent infrastructure on the back end. There are differences where they're not quite the same things on the back end. So, for example, in the back end, you need to store your events permanently, right? So you can't quite draw the same parallels. Um, Now, what I would say is from a benefits perspective, I think this is where I can draw the most parallels. That when you have to reason about how your application is changing, it's easier to reason about the deltas themselves than the state as a whole. So when you can isolate, hey, I'm only changing this one particular thing, and it's going to affect my state in this particularly defined way, where your functions are essentially pure functions, right? You have your state input, you have a state output, and then you have a pure function that is transforming state input into state output with a delta. And this process of going from state transitions from one to another, and using that delta as the primary player in your system, this is what event sourcing is all about. Instead of focusing on the state as a whole and having this kind of weird thing where you have a giant function that is trying to do all sorts of crazy things and having all sorts of different case switch statements of, maybe I want to do this, maybe I want to do that, maybe I want to use this service with a combination of this other thing. No, just think about everything as a pure function where you have state input, state output, and some delta in between, and a function that is going to help you transform that delta into the state input to state output transition.
All right. I think that's very much clear. So it's more like from what you describe, it's more like a permanent how will I put it? More like a permanent like way of like constantly getting like information that you may kind of put in your state. So it's just like I won't really say it's a database, but it's just like a small store kind of, right? Does it seem like that?
Yeah, precisely.
All right. I think that makes sense. Yeah, Chris, do you have any question on that? Maybe to create like parallel between that and like a front end. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was laughing a bit back there when Lucas mentioned there's people who probably don't even know what event sourcing is, and I'm maybe one of those. So no, I guess to not like just to be a total noob, but maybe to relate to kind of the front end and things like that. I guess the only thing, like the buzzword I think of, but it's maybe not the exact same thing, is I know there's these event, I'm not even sure what they're called, like event databases, but I feel like what you're doing is even more generalized, and it may be just the architecture itself, and you maybe don't need like a database and all this event driven thing. But maybe what we could touch on a few times throughout the podcast is like how it relates to the front end. What I do know with the whole Flux thing and the event sourcing and why really it was made is kind of what you mentioned already. There's a great talk. Maybe I'll look it up and post it at the end of the show. But from why Facebook kind of came up with this, and they weren't the ones who invented it, but when they were working on their chat, they had all these, chat is super like state intensive. You have how many messages are unread, number of people, all this stuff. And they found, doing it like without pure functions, without event sourcing, every time they tried to add a new feature, they would get regressions elsewhere in the state. But yeah, that's that's my extent of what I know about event sourcing. And And yeah, I don't know. I'm just kind of rambling on. Probably reflects how little I know about this.
No, but I think that's pretty much in line with the proposition of it, right? Because there is a payment that you have to do. You have to pay the piper up front, right? You have to put in some work to understand these concepts and get the infrastructure in place. I mean, if you think about it from the front end perspective, right? Imagine that you're transitioning from some application that was built with pure HTML and some jQuery, and it's this giant monolith like mess, right? And then you say to the team, hey, you know what, let's move this to a single page application based on React and Redux, right? If you're doing that, you're going to have to pay some costs up front. You're going to have to educate people or get people that are already educated. And you're going to have some guardrails and some libraries and some abstractions that are going to help you deploy this. It's not something that you're going to do overnight. So the proposition with event sourcing, though, is that once you have paid that cost, that you essentially go slow at first to go fast later at a sustainable rate, where you're not eventually going to hit a wall. Because with these big applications, where you have a ball of a band-aid on top of a ball of band-aid, you essentially hit a wall at some point where you get so many regressions that you cannot develop anything. You have diminishing returns every time you add a feature. So the proposition with event sourcing is that similarly, you have a cost to pay upfront, but with the benefit that after you've paid that cost, you'll be able to go very quickly because the system is easy to reason about, despite the system growing disproportionately in the number of features.
Now, how is that actually done in practice? Because like, in theory, that sounds great. This sounds like this would solve a lot of the complexities that big code bases have, which I think most of us know how that goes. Like most of us have worked in a big code base, and despite all the good intentions of everyone of keeping the code organized, it's just natural for things to get outdated because there are new patterns and you don't always come back to refactor the entire thing. And then you start getting parts that are considered legacy, right? How in practice does what you were saying would work to avoid this complexity building up over time?
So that's a great question, because the reality of it, like with anything, right, is that you get these promises and you have to know how these are going to come true, if they can come true in the first place. So firstly, I would highlight that, I mean, I'm an engineer. I'm all about trade-offs. I don't just preach and, say, this is going to be a silver bullet. There are no such things in engineering. Everybody with some degree of experience knows that. But that being said, if you truly want to walk to the promised land, there are two aspects that you have to cover. One is the technical aspect, where you have your infrastructure and you have to know how to deploy that, how to set up your CI, how to set up the different components that you need, like a place to store your events, a way to queue your events, a way to process your events, a way to react to your events. And you have to know how you're going to do that and make a plan for it. And second of all, it's the people aspect, where you have to onboard people into this new way of thinking, perhaps unlearn some of the patterns that they've been using. Everybody loves doing this create, read, update, delete kind of application because it's simple. There are a ton of frameworks like Rails in Ruby. You have frameworks in JavaScript as well. You have frameworks in PHP like Symfony and Laravel that just help you do this create, read, update, delete, right? But if you're changing your way of thinking into thinking about the deltas and thinking in pure functions, you need new abstractions. And it's not just the technical implementation of those abstractions, it's the convincing the people, right? And luckily, with event sourcing, once you do, a modicum of training, maybe 2-3 weeks where you put in some serious time into studying it, you can get quite good. And assuming that you've set up the infrastructure. And if you've done that and you do it with an initial part of your system, so you don't move everything at once, of course, you don't do a big bang rewrite, you move a specific part of your system, and then once you're done, you'll be in a position where you've trained your team to use event sourcing. You have moved a part of your system to event sourcing because you thought it would deliver some business value, and hopefully you've set up the technical infrastructure concerns as well. Depending on how much you want to implement yourself, you can go from deploying things as quickly as 2 to 3 weeks in terms of the infrastructure, plus 2 to 3 weeks in terms of training yourself and developing the first couple of features, to going over a year or 2 years if you really want to do everything from the ground up, right? So, for example, when it comes to the infrastructure, you can build your own event store, and I know people that have actually interacted with the file system, built a whole entire library to address the concern of the event store, and then they have to add in all these features like indexing, which if you just wrapped a traditional database, you could get it essentially almost for free, right? When it comes to queuing systems, there are people that implement their own queuing systems. They use things like RabbitMQ, and they customize on top of it. And there are abstractions out there. There's a range of abstractions at different sides of the spectrum in terms of how much you need to know. We, of course, at Ambar, we make it essentially as easy. We're on one side of the spectrum where it's as easy as it gets, right? But of course, that comes at a cost where you have to pay for it, right? But the more you are comfortable with using the existing tooling that's out there, like using Postgres, using MySQL, or using Ambar, or using technologies to deploy web servers like Cloud Run or Fargate, and not complicating your life, doing your own Kubernetes deployment. If you just do it the simplest way, and you use existing tooling, you can get set up in about a month and a half, including technical time and training time. And I think that's and I've seen that in practice, and I think that's quite impressive for something where you need to flip everything. But people, because we're engineers, we fall into the trap of, I need to understand absolutely everything. We don't do this if we're implementing a file storage, right? We don't need to understand how S3 works. We just use it. So my general advice after giving you the details of how to go about it is pick your battles in what you need to learn, and learn the things that are going to make a difference for you as a business, not the things that are just problems that are already solved.
Okay, that does make sense. It is still a bit scary, but I think I agree with you. Like, we allow so many abstractions, especially JavaScript developers. We are so used to frameworks. There are just layers on top of layers and layers and layers of abstraction. And for some reason, I still find it a bit weird to abstract an event sourcing layer. But I think this is more about the fact that I don't feel as comfortable with it doing natively to be okay with an abstraction. Almost like um, I first wanted to understand the fundamentals of front-end development before I went into frameworks that would abstract that away, so that I have the knowledge of what's going on under the hood. But you're also correct in the sense that I use MongoDB without knowing how it actually stores the data. I just use it. It almost feels like MongoDB is the lowest level, but it's not. It's like still a high level abstraction. SQL is still a high level abstraction within how the data is actually stored and retrieved internally in the SQL database. So I think you touched on a good point. From your experience dealing with people that are starting out with event sourcing, is it also very common to have people that fear this abstraction layer? And why do you think that is the case versus other abstractions that already exist and people are comfortable with? I think GraphQL can be a good analogy, because in a way, people are very comfortable with just creating REST API routes and just doing it with Express. Although Express is an abstraction, it does feel low level enough. I know that somebody's going to hate on me because I'm saying low level for something like Express.js, whatever. But it does feel, because you have a lot of control over how the handlers are being created. Versus if you're using an abstraction on top of GraphQL, there are some very, very opinionated ones, like Apollo server being maybe one of the most opinionated ones. So maybe event sourcing can be compared to it, like event sourcing abstractions in the backend could be compared to GraphQL abstractions, in the sense that you want to know how it's working under the hood, but at the same time, why do you need it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it as everything, there's nuance always, right? And I think it's a fair thing to call out GraphQL, because people like to understand it to different degrees. I would point out that in general, where I see people that are most excited about event sourcing and that spend the most time in learning it are people that are closer to the beginning of their careers, because it seems like, oh my gosh, there's so much technical content here, right? Some subjects you can only go so far before it starts feeling a little bit too abstract. There's too much mathematics in it, so it's maybe a bit discouraging. Whereas event sourcing is quite rich in that there's a lot to learn, especially because today and it's something we're trying to solve with our free course. Today, learning event sourcing still feels like going to that planet that Luke Skywalker goes to in Star Wars to find Master Yoda, where it's, oh my gosh, I'm going to go and find some hermit that's going to teach me all about this stuff. And that feels exciting, right? Because it feels quite unique. And I think that's the reason that people are wanting to, dive deeper into it. But I mean, I've been around for a bit, and I can tell you that the most successful engineers that I know have always known how to balance that out, right? Understand just enough and perhaps a little bit more to be able to judge that you know just enough, so that you can then build something for your business, right? And you keep both of those in check. You obviously don't want to accrue too much technical debt, but at the same time, you don't want to accrue too much business debt. It's something that we talk about very little, right? Like, what about, there's technical debt, sure, but there's business debt as well, right? Where you're spending some time implementing some technical things that are pretty great, but at the cost of slowing down in the business, right? So you need to balance both of them out. And I would say that the engineers who will be the most successful with event sourcing are the ones that can make the distinction and understand that they need to get a little bit of both. Now, in the sense of the comparison to GraphQL, I think something similar happens there, right? Where there are engineers that understand how the runtime engine works and understand that and use it to for the better of their applications. But maybe you don't need to, right? Like, maybe you need to understand it just to a degree, or maybe you only need one person in your team to understand that, right? So there are parallels there, I'd say, and I would suggest with event sourcing to learn more about the parts that are relevant to the business and not the parts that are implementation details, for which there are plenty of things, plenty of resources out there that could help you implement it. My recommendation is that maybe you get one person on your team to understand that very deeply and guide the rest of the team, but the rest of the team should just understand the business concepts and core building blocks from a coding perspective.
Yep, that does make a lot of sense. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the possible abstractions that exist to simplify the lives of people that are getting into event sourcing. Of course, there's Ambar, right, and it solves a lot of problems. But besides that, and I think we can also talk a little bit more about that, like which exact problems does Ambar would solve versus how you would do it without it. But also, are there other abstractions that you would recommend? And keep in mind that for people that are doing React on the front end, they are most usually, not always, but most usually also doing Node.js in the backend. That is definitely the most popular stack for those for front-end developers. So do you recommend any frameworks or libraries for those running Node.js in the backend that would allow them to more quickly jumpstart an event sourcing backend?
So I know that there are some frameworks that abstract event sourcing as a whole, right? But unfortunately, they can be quite opinionated and restrict you. What I would say that you should go and grab from a framework, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a framework for TypeScript. You can grab it from essentially any framework. Is the schema that you need for your event store, and you can either do something very similar to the schema that specialized event sourcing database like EventStoreDB or Axonic do, or you can go and look at certain really great libraries like MessageDB, for example, or there's Proof in PHP, there's Event Source, there is Ecotone, and there are quite a few libraries that at least give you the schema and give you the patterns that you need. Beyond that, you don't need very much. Everything in event sourcing tends to be just a implementing the same four patterns, or you're writing, reading, processing, or reacting with other events, and you don't really need a framework for that. So what I say is the most important thing is just grabbing the schema and making that correct for the place where you're storing your events. and use a pick a good database, right? Don't implement your own event store yourself. Just pick Postgres, pick MySQL, pick SQL Server. In JavaScript, it's probably very unlikely I'll pick SQL Server. Maybe if you're doing .NET. But yeah, you can also pick NoSQL event stores. I generally don't recommend those because they are a little bit harder to maintain. I recommend that on the other side when you're processing your events. You can also pick an event store like Axonic or Event Store DB that specialize in event sourcing. But the problem with that is that sometimes you might want to have some cheat codes, and they limit the functionality of the set of things that you can do. So if you ask me for a classic stack how we would do it today, I would just go and look at a schema, and from one of these big libraries, I would use something like Postgres to commit my events. I would use something like Ambar to do my messaging, and I would use DynamoDB or Cosmos DB or whatever, or MongoDB, whatever SQL NoSQL flavor you want for your processing. Because something key that I don't think I quite mentioned is that in event sourcing, right, you need to build your state. In that state, you might need to rebuild it. So imagine if in your application in the front end, right, I asked you take all the historical events and build the state from scratch and apply all those pure functions again and again and again and again. The place where you're depositing and storing that state needs to be very scalable, and but it doesn't need to have some consistency guarantees that you would need on your writing, because you don't need you simply don't need those. So the easiest thing to do is just to use a NoSQL database on that other end. So again, to summarize, pick a nice schema by looking at the great libraries that are out there. You can just look them up. And I think stars on GitHub is a decent heuristic. Pick Postgres, pick Ambar or a system that does something like Ambar. If you take our course, we'll tell you how to implement it yourself, and then pick DynamoDB for your read model storage.
Okay, perfect. I think this is pretty good for people that want to start and try it out. What about you, Peter, Chris? Any specific questions thus far?
Yeah, not really. I think it was kind of well explained. Yeah, actually the uses, the use cases, and then like also advice on when to use it and how to use it. I think that was kind of covered. Yeah.
Yep, that's fair. So I'd say that you need to. So in our course, we cover the pros and cons, right? And we cover benefits and drawbacks and when it's a good idea to use it. If your application is going to be changing very often, so if your requirements change all the time, consider event sourcing. If your application has a process-driven feature set, so you're handling money and your state is changing all the time, you're shipping items, you need to track where things are, consider event sourcing. If you need to have auditability, just by design, so if you're in financial services, event sourcing is almost a requirement. You need to have some sort of ledger, like when you're doing accounting. And if you think that you need to have a capability to debug more easily and you want that speed, if all of those things line up, then event sourcing is for you. However, there are some drawbacks. The community is small, so you don't have a lot of help if you want to get people to actually collaborate with you so that they answer your questions. It's not like React or Angular. The community is very small. So I recommend that you know that up front and that you educate yourself. But if you can get past that initial cost of education and a little bit of infrastructure setup, and you have a changing application, you have auditability requirements, or you have a very complex feature set that is very process driven, then consider event sourcing. But as with everything, the devil's in details, and you should use critical thinking. Now, as for how to do it, well, the recommendation would be talk to people that have done it before.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, sounds good. That's fair. Yeah, Chris, do you have any question as well?
Yeah, Luis, you basically kind of answered my question already. Now, I was going to ask, so we talked about kind of how event sourcing can kind of simplify or at least make it easier for your organization to reduce regressions or over complex functions. And then you kind of, I was thinking that, of course, auditing is naturally easier. You have an event for everything that happens. Are there any other, I guess, like easy wins or advantages you could mention that you can think of with event sourcing versus something like the traditional monolith CRUD application?
Yeah, so it helps you decouple things as well, and it helps you reason. So it helps you reason about things, right? It helps you decouple your teams, and it just really it really, as an organization, right? When you're a certain size, it means that you don't have to bother other people. So it's not only about the capability that you have to reason about it just yourself, but also the capability that you have to reason about it independently from others.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Of course, guys, we only really touched the surface. There is a lot more that we could talk about in terms of event sourcing, especially like how to scale it and like the common structures that companies, like big companies, use to scale um, their distributed systems, and also some of the other drawbacks of distributed systems, like the fact that you don't get consistency immediately. So it might take a little while for the entire system to process the request. So right now we are very used to making a post request and then making a get right immediately after that and expecting the data to be there because we just made a post request. With distributed systems, that might not be the case, at least immediately, because you basically send the event and it takes a while for everything to process that event and update the read layers so that the data is actually there for you to retrieve. So there are definitely some other complexities that go with this approach, but there's also a lot of scalability benefits as well, and we didn't even touch on that yet. But I wanted to know, like, if this is a subject that you guys think we can briefly touch upon before wrapping up, because I'm also looking at the time and I don't want to make this too extensive for the audience. But perhaps we could at least touch upon that just so that people are aware of the drawbacks of going in that route.
So let me perhaps at least get the party started and try to be succinct and short and sweet with it. So with event sourcing, you are picking where your scalability, how to implement your scalability. So if you think about scalability, right, if you need to do things in parallel, you cannot do it in such a way. Parallel is the opposite of sequential, right? So if you're doing, the hash of a 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 hash, well, you need the results in order to be able to calculate the next hash, right? And so on and so forth. So if you are just doing an eternal hash of the same thing, you can't really scale that, right? Because it's just a thing that you have to do in a single thread. Now, in event sourcing, you're essentially picking where those boundaries are, right? And you say, you know what, I'm going to simplify it and just call it an entity, but you specify where those scalability boundaries are. So for example, you say, you know what, I'm going to process all the events for a user profile, not just for a user profile, just in the same stream. I'm going to process all the events for a certain dispatchment from the warehouse, all in the same stream. I'm going to process a bank account all in the same stream, or maybe I don't want to process the bank account in the same stream. Maybe what I want to do is process all the events for the same account cycle for the month in the same stream. And it essentially makes you think from the get-go of where those boundaries lie, so that you can know where you can parallelize the work and which events will be synchronous and which ones will be asynchronous. So if you have something that's happening inside the same user profile, for example, you might have some validation rules that allow you to say, hey, I can only, become I can only add a secondary email if I've verified my first one, for example. That's, a simple validation rule that you could do transactionally. Now, you cannot quite do a validation against, something that is not in that same stream of events. In event sourcing, you essentially are asked from the get-go, think about where your boundaries are so that if you do need to scale your system, you have already um, built it, built your system in such a way that you recognize what's asynchronous and comes from other streams, and it is synchronous and comes from the same stream.
Yep, that's a very, very succinct way to put it. Definitely a lot of this also opens up a lot of other questions. But again, if anyone wants to dive deeper onto that, they can just sign up for the free course that Umbar offers. So just go to umbar.cloud/ESC for which stands for Event Sourcing Course, and then you can sign up for a free course, so long as it's remaining free. So definitely don't take too long to do it, because as I said before, I do think that Luis should start charging for that. So make sure you do it while he's still doing it for free, because there's a ton of value packed onto that. All right, so I think that for me, maybe we can start wrapping it up. And before I do so, Chris, Peter, do you guys are good? Do you want to make any last questions on this subject?
Yeah, I'm good. I think he answered. Yeah, Luis answered every question perfectly. Yeah, that's good.
I had
Awesome.
I had one last question. Maybe it's not even applicable. How do you look at, or yeah, is it even a consideration when you have a sort of migration, right? So you have your entity. I don't know. I have first name and last name. Let's say I have middle name now. Is that just become a new event, or are there different strategies, or how does that look in event sourcing?
So it forces you to recognize this right away, right? Because in traditional applications, what do? You add a column to the database and you leave it empty, right? And you make it nullable. And in event sourcing, it's something simple where something similar, sorry, where you have to now reason about, well, what does my current state look like if I have never had a middle name event? So what you would traditionally do is you would add new event altogether, where in your sign up, maybe you require that middle name. And if you can now see that there will be times where you have this new sign up version and times where a user hasn't done that sign up version, but you immediately recognize and you can see in your pure functions again that you can go from a state of having no middle name to a state of having a middle name. Maybe you can delete your middle name as well, but you have to recognize that because you haven't only had events that can create a user profile with a middle name, you have to recognize in those functions that you could create a user that doesn't have a middle name. And it's that explicitness that forces you to think about your application. And if you're now asking about the way that I would implement it, if I would to do a migration, I would do a new event, right? That includes this middle name, and then I would have to then go and handle modify my pure functions that allow me to determine the new state. If the question were to come more from how would I migrate from out of event sourcing into event sourcing, normally you go through a migration path where you say, okay, I have these entities and I'm gonna onboard them, right? So you would have something like the first event ever, something like onboarded user profile or something like that, or imported it or whatever it is, and then you would slowly build those events for the rest of your system and migrate your application slowly into event sourcing. But it's actually more common to not start out with an old feature, but to start with a new feature, because then you can reap the benefits right away.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you.
All right, awesome. So before we wrap things up, let's just do a quick round of promos. Luis, do you wanna start?
Sure. So yeah, my name is Luis. I'm founder and CEO of Ambar. We are a data streaming company focused particularly on architectures like event sourcing. We are offering a free course. Before we sell you anything, we like to provide you with a lot of value. So if you go to Ambar, which is AMBAR .cloud/ESC, you can take our free event sourcing course. I will hope that it can remain free for as long as possible. And it's intense. It's about a week worth of time. It's not, it's essentially 3 hours a day that you should expect to invest, but you should come out of it very confident that you can do it in production. And if you don't feel confident anyway, we are there in our Slack community as well to help you out. Anyway, again, that's Ambar, ambar.cloud/ESC.
Awesome. Thank you. I also sent it in the comment section for those of you that are listening from YouTube or any other streaming platforms. Peter, how about you?
Okay, yeah, for today, I don't have any promo. I think, yeah.
All right. And Chris?
Yeah, I'll just post the YouTube video of the Facebook talk I mentioned. If you search YouTube, that's the title here, I think, Rethinking Web App Development at Facebook. And yeah, it talks about what I mentioned, how they ran into a bunch of problems with their chat. And then they kind of evolved into this basically event sourcing methodology. So it's quite interesting.
Awesome. Yeah, it does help a lot to see use cases from big companies. For any of you that want to know which companies are doing distributed systems, you can just look on YouTube or Google, and you will see that actually most of the big ones are doing it. Because once you get to a level where you need to serve billions of requests, then there aren't really many other choices besides doing that. I mean, at least not until we hit reliable quantum computing. But until then, I think we're actually going to need a lot of distributed systems in order to scale to the size that those big companies are scaling to. So you can be sure that, for example, Twitter, Instagram, they are running distributed systems to be able to serve users in the scale that they are serving. So yeah, it is definitely really interesting to learn about that. I also, just to wrap things up, also want to say that once I first learned about event sourcing and CQRS, which is a pattern that it's basically a pattern on top of event sourcing, I really thought, okay, this is the holy grail and I need to stop all that I'm doing. And from now on, I have to write every backend this way. And I just want to let you all know that you also don't need to go that path. So it is really beautiful. It is really amazing and scalable and very flexible. But you also can't keep doing things the way that you're doing. Just know that once you start really worrying about the scale of your application in a big way, and you also have the auditability concerns that Luis was mentioning, like you need to have this track record of everything that is happening in the application, then this is a really excellent solution. But you don't need to already start with it on your next hobby project. But do definitely study more about it, be aware of this pattern so that once you feel that it is the right pattern to apply for a given project, then you already know that it exists and how you can apply it. All right, so that's going to be it for me. I'm going to promote envoy.com. It is my company as well, so I am a bit biased to say it, but from experience to talking to our clients, they always say that we really are different from everything that they have found in the market thus far. So if you're interested in a very client-friendly business model for companies that are looking for design services or software development services, especially front-end development, which is what we do really, really well with Angular and with React, definitely check out envoy.com. It's unvoid.com. All right, that's it for me. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Cheers, guys. Cheers.